I'm fortunate enough not just to work with athletes, but to work with people from every walk of life, and people who are in discomfort, and people who are rehabbing or post-rehab, and what we need to look at is the task at hand, the activities of daily living, and what are the qualities that they need to fulfill, one, their goals and their lifestyle, two, if it's something at a higher level, what is it we need to look at from that perspective. So if you want to talk about it from an athletics standpoint and a strength and conditioning standpoint, obviously strength training is the ability to move a mass over a certain distance,
Mm-hmm.
and to be able to sustain that contraction for maybe a certain amount of time, or the shortest amount of time, and move a particular mass over that amount of time,
Mm-hmm.
over the shortest amount of time. So typically when we look at strength the way it's been taught to us, Michol, it's always been it's been in an isolated state in many cases. It's been one plane of motion in many cases, and it's been in a concentric environment rather than an eccentric environment, which I think we'll probably talk about, knowing you and I, over the course of these next few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But when we look at it from a historical perspective, I'm concerned of how it's being applied into the athletic environment. And
Yeah.
what I mean by this is we need the strength as a foundation. We need the strength to be able to achieve a particular task.
Right.
When we achieve that task, how efficiently are we doing that?
Mm-hmm.
And the way I look at things is, are we compensating to be able to do that task? Because I don't care who it is. I don't care if it's grandma or grandpa or your highest level athlete. They want to get a particular task done.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, is the more driven they are, I think the more compensatory movement patterns we start to see. But as far as strength as a foundation, we absolutely need that to be able to build mass, to be able to build endurance, to be able to allow the cross-sectional fibers of muscle tissue to become greater, and therefore sustain greater amount of forces and mitigate forces and absorb forces. And so I think we need to identify how we're going to describe the strength for the particular environment or the particular task at hand.
And I think here's where I'm challenged by this kind of conventional notion of strength that we all were taught and we all subscribe to. I think where I challenge that is in what produces the ability in our bodies to be able to exert a force against a external object or implement or person or anything external to our bodies. We all often zeroed in on the idea of the musculature being this kind of sweet spot of the tissues that can really generate the forces, the requisite amount of forces, to be able to exert something, an internal force, against the external object or whatever it may be. I struggle with, and you and I talked about this idea of integration or isolation. I struggle with just looking at the muscle on its own and that's it. Because when we look at it, the muscle's part of an organization in the human body that really is an aggregate, and they all kind of happen and function together. And so, what I think we need to do is to look at what we have in terms of our bodies that can produce a force, and what can create stability so that we can generate more force. And, how does the nervous system really apply to all this as well? Because if it recognizes more stability, Chucky, then we can often say, well, the body can produce more force. Well, if we're inherently more stable, then could we not generate more force because our nervous system recognizes more stability? So, the two-leg push versus a standing on one-leg push, our force went down and our power and strength went down because we were more unstable. Well, all these things are in flux. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And so for us, it really is, what is strength at the end of the day? Is it only putting ourselves in the most stable environment and absolutely trying to access as much of the actin and myosin that we have in our muscle bundles to exert a force, or is it timing related? Is it position specific?
Michol, the answer to what you're asking, and you've raised, I would say, in your brilliant mind, maybe 10 different points in this last 30 seconds that you posed questions, and the answer is yes to all of them.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean anything, because I believe it still has to come back to what is the task at hand.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we look at strength for the task at hand, then you talk about, well, if somebody is strong, then they're stable. If they're stable, I think we need to address stability, because what happens when you have a joint segment or a bone segment that becomes somewhat malaligned?
Mm-hmm.
What's the body naturally have a tendency to do?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to splint down and stabilize it.
Mm-hmm.
So now you've got something that is too stable because of possibly a malalignment issue. Then the entire system is going to be malaligned because of the connective tissue and the. I don't want to go down the road yet, but I know we're going to have a discussion on fascia. When you look at the tensegrity model and you look at the tensions that are created because of a segment that's out of alignment, now you've got a lot of stability. So what happens to the mobility? That stability on one side, mobility on the other, historically we've treated them as two distinct variables, that one is the opposite of the other, when in fact I believe they're on the same continuum that depend on each other.
Mm-hmm.
Take somebody who's been through a specific strength training program, a traditional strength training program that has been isolated, that's gained a lot of hypertrophy, that has gained strength. There's no question about it, and we need that. I'm not saying not to do it, but then what happens when we need to have them increase that mobility in all three planes? Historically, particularly if it's an athletic movement, I've seen limitations. I've seen a lot of compensations. I've seen movement patterns that are not clean, that are not efficient, that are not symmetrical, that are not rhythmical, that have this load, stabilize, unload component to it, and that's where we start to see injuries occur again.
Yeah. So if we think about, the relevance of starting and imposing stresses on the body that are progressive, and perhaps they're in an intelligent form where the body has time to adapt, at a certain point of building a strong foundation, here's my question, is it necessary, in your opinion, to then acquire strength in different joint positions at different speeds if the outcome is going to be athletic in nature? So once we build the strong foundation, because I see it as, if we train an individual, an athlete, to survive the rigors of the game, what we would look to do is really access specific joint speeds, joint positions, timing. We talk a lot about in terms of how we are actually turning the system on and off to acquire speed and to acquire the ability to either change directions or exert a force against a different player, or on a bat, on a ball, whatever the case may be. But at a certain point, as we go down and march down that road, it has to be more specific as we move forward. Just would love to get your thoughts around that.
Well, part of that, again, Michol, and let's just deal with the athlete right now, not necessarily if they've had any injuries or any other issues, but I don't care if it's an athlete, or I don't care if it's the sedentary population. The way I look at movement is that we need to get good quality movement, and we have to look at the big movement rocks, particularly foot and ankle complex, especially the ability to dorsiflex. You don't dorsiflex well, you're going to have too much quad dominant movements. You're not going to load the glutes. You're not going to get into a good anterior pelvic tilt to be able to load the glutes. You see compensations in the spine, and there's all kinds of issues going on.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you look at athletic movements, well, let me come back to that for a second. When we look at traditional models of strength training and deadlifts, squats, power cleans, all good movements, all good strength-producing movements. And if you want to put in, for those that may be listening or watching, okay, what about the isolationist of bench press and shoulder press. I'm not saying anything negative about this stuff, but that's an isolation.
Mm-hmm.
Go back to the squat. We go back to the power clean. We go back to deadlift. What position are the feet typically in when we're taking or when we're doing the movement, when we're approaching the bar? And that's usually a bilateral stance,
Mm-hmm.
which is the most unstable in being biped.
Yep.
The most unstable, lack of power position. But
right. Especially when you're talking about athletes, Chuck, aren't you? I mean, when you're talking about athletes, if you and I are playing a sport and my feet are like right here, you know, the chances of me actually increasing my performance are going to be radically diminished if that's the case.
And that's my point, Michol, is that particularly in the athletic environment, I love when I was playing competitive sports and I played pro baseball for way back in the day. When I saw certain guys now who are in certain positions where there's lack of dorsiflexion, feet is, as you put it, a bilateral stance, lack of dorsiflexion, not loading very well, I'm saying this is somebody who's either very weak at their position, very non-reactive, and is somebody who is just not going to be extremely explosive.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look back at, let's do the strength training, let's do the traditional lift, but now we have to look at it in 3 planes of motion.